you live on our Lone Oak Baptist Church Facebook page. Uh, Trust that you are doing well, or at least as well as can be expected during the time that we're in right now. You guys know we're experiencing something that most of us currently on this planet never experienced with what's going on with this virus. And then on top of that, we've had some challenges as a church family as well. Several families experiencing personal crises in the midst of all this, and that certainly doesn't make it any easier. And one of the worst things about all of this is feeling like we're just waiting. We're in limbo. Like we can't really do much, and we can't plan on much going forward at this point until we know that this virus is contained and things can begin to get back to normal. But on the other hand, there's much that we can do. We are the church. We are God's ambassadors of His good news and His goodwill. So this week's message, today's message, will focus on what we need to do to survive and thrive in crisis. And the next week, we'll look at what we will do as we come out on the other side of this crisis. And so, I know there's a lot out there already about surviving and thriving in a crisis. Probably every preacher in the world has a message on thriving in a crisis. But I think it's important to talk through some things, to talk through what it looks like to survive and to thrive in a crisis in our world today. So we're going to look today at Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 17 from the New Living Translation. So I'll give you just a second to find that in your Bible or on your Bible app. Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 17. I'll begin reading. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people, all of what? Well, all of what he had just said, that's recorded in chapter 6 of Luke. When he finished all that, he returned to Capernaum. At that time, the highly valued slave of a Roman officer was sick and near death. When the officer heard of this, he sent some respected Jewish elders to ask him to come and heal his slave. So they earnestly begged Jesus to help the man. If anyone deserves your help, he does, they said, for he loves the Jewish people and even built a synagogue for us. Verse 6, so Jesus went with them. But just before they arrived at the house, the officer sent some friends to say, Lord, don't trouble yourself by coming to my home, for I'm not worthy of such an honor. I'm not even worthy to come and meet you. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I am under the authority of my superior officers. And I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say go, and they go. Come, and they come. And if I say to my slaves, do this, they do it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to the crowd that was following him, he said, I tell you, I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel. And when the officer's friends returned to his house, they found the slave completely healed. Soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him there. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. Don't cry, he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it. And the bearer stopped. Young man, he said, I tell you, get up. Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Great fear swept the crowd, and they praised God, saying, a mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today. And the news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. So here we have in this passage a couple of episodes in the lives of two different individuals where they face a crisis situation. And we can learn some things from what these people experienced and how Jesus responded to them. So I'm going to give you 5 things today, 5 things that will help you not only survive through this crisis, but even come out on the other side thriving in the midst of this crisis. So the first one, understand that crisis is going to come. Understand that crisis is going to come. You cannot totally avoid crisis in this life. I don't care how careful you are, a crisis will eventually find you. It could be a worldwide crisis like we're dealing with now. It could be a personal crisis or a crisis among a group of which you're a part. The fact is, times of crisis will come. You cannot protect yourself. You cannot protect your loved ones enough to avoid every crisis in life. It's just not possible. So we're going to deal with crisis. In fact, all throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, we see examples of God's people dealing with crisis. Noah and the flood, David and King Saul, David and Goliath, the prophets during the time of Israel's exile to foreign nations. I think about Elijah in particular in his bouts. Jesus dealing with rejection, torture, and crucifixion. God's people are not immune from a crisis. They're going to come. Sometimes as Christians, we have the idea that if we'll just do everything right, we'll somehow avoid crisis. And if we are experiencing a crisis, it's because God is punishing us or He's trying to get our attention. Listen, crisis comes for the good people and the bad people. In fact, in our scripture passage today, we see two good people dealing with crisis who, from as far as we can tell, were good people. Right? There was the Roman officer who showed true care and concern for his slave. And then there was the widow who had lost her only son. We're not given any indication, any impression that these were in any way bad people or people deserving of a crisis or that God was even trying to teach them a lesson or get their attention because they weren't doing the right thing or something. But I will tell you what God will do with a crisis and through a crisis. He will use it for our good and for His glory. You see, when God can tell the floodwaters to recede, and He can provide a rainbow as a promise, and replenish the earth afterwards, after a big flood. God can empower a person like David to defeat Goliath and set David up to become the king. God can teach someone like David great life lessons through a great friendship, like he had with Jonathan, as he endures the pursuit of Saul trying to kill him. God can return His people to their promised land, and God can raise His Son from the dead, providing forgiveness and freedom for you and for me. See, God can use a crisis for our good and for His glory. But remember, crisis will come. There's a Peanuts comic strip where Charlie Brown is sitting on the curb and it begins to rain, and the next frame it's raining a little more, and the next frame it's raining even harder, and the last frame he says, "It always rains on the unloved." Well, I got news for you, Charlie Brown. It rains on the loved and the unloved, right? Crisis comes on the loved and the unloved. We all deal with crisis. So we will do well to remember that when we head into a crisis, it's part of life. It's no fun, right? But it's part of what we have to deal with. Second thing, acknowledge the troubling nature of a crisis. Acknowledge the troubling nature of a crisis. And you might say to yourself, well, no kidding, preacher. Crisis is troubling. Well, you're right. It's a no-brainer. But it's important to acknowledge the troubling nature of a crisis because you can't really address it correctly if you don't recognize the troubling aspects of it. So in our passage for today, the Roman officer was troubled. This troubled his friends who brought the matter to Jesus. It troubled Jesus enough to act because Jesus agreed to stop what he was doing and go with them. Obviously, in the second story, the widow lady was troubled, and she would now have no one to take care of her. There was trouble. And what we're dealing with today as a nation and as a world is quite troubling. I mean, maybe we tried to deny the extent of the trouble at first. Maybe we were hesitant to believe it could really be all that much trouble to us and to our families and our jobs. But guess what? Here we are. It hasn't gotten any better. It's only become even more troubling. But before we get too down, before we get too discouraged, let me remind you that trouble is the nature of a crisis. We wouldn't call it a crisis if it wasn't any trouble, right? And so it's there's going to be trouble. I want to remind you of what Jesus said in John 16:33. That's John 16:33. He said, "Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world." So listen, here on earth, you and I will face some troubles. We'll face some trials. We'll face some sorrows. But we can take heart, and we can even rejoice in the face of it. Because with Jesus living in us, we can know that we too can overcome the world. We can overcome the trials and the sorrows. That's important. That's important to acknowledge that crisis brings trouble. A third thing is that we need to accept that a crisis reveals character. We need to accept that crisis reveals character. Character is who you really are at your core, right? Your character will impact, it will even dictate how you respond to or react to a crisis. If at your core you're a person of faith, a person who believes the best of others, a person who wants the best for others, those things are going to rise to the surface during a crisis. On the other hand, what will also rise to the surface is any inconsistencies in your life, any flaws, any weaknesses. So you want to live your life in a way that when you find yourself in a crisis, your positive traits are stronger and more prominent than your weaker traits. We all have weaknesses. We've got to make sure those positive traits overcome those weaker traits in a crisis. It was Robin Williams, the actor, who put it this way. He said, "You will have bad times, but they will always wake you up to the things you weren't paying attention to." So if you're not paying attention to where your character is, in a crisis, when those bad times come, you're going to be awakened to those issues in your life. So pay attention to that. Now, I don't know of anywhere right now where this is better illustrated than on Facebook. I mean, just look through your news feed at how people are handling this crisis. You'll see some whose fear is obviously much greater than their faith. You will see some who take responsibility for their own actions and decide to do certain things, right things. And then you'll see some who just want to blame everybody, looking for somebody else to blame and not take responsibility. You'll see those who are truly judgmental at their core, but you'll also see those who are loving and compassionate at their core. Character is going to come out in a crisis. In our passage, the character of the Roman officer stands out, doesn't it? I mean, not only do we have Jesus praising his faith, I mean, that's very telling and incredible in itself, but we also have recorded for us that he valued his slave. He valued him. And you might be tempted to think, well, yeah, at best he was an employee that the guy needed, so he was valuable to him. But that wouldn't be the right kind of thinking. Okay, the Greek word translated here as valued is intimos, and it means held in honor or precious. It's the same word used in 1 Peter 2:6, where Peter quotes Isaiah 28, identifying Jesus as the precious cornerstone. Right? It is not an accurate statement to say that the slave was monetarily valued by the officer. That is not what is meant. He was dear to him. He was precious to him, just like Jesus is the precious, valued, honored cornerstone. So for a Roman officer to exhibit that kind of care and concern for his slave says volumes about this man's character in the midst of his personal crisis. So here's a question for you. How are you handling the current crisis? Which character traits of your life are showing themselves the most? I hope and trust it's the good ones, the Christ-like ones. And if not, allow God to use this crisis for your good, making you a better person, helping you to become more Christ-like. Well, a fourth thing that's going to help you survive and even thrive in a crisis is to be aware that crisis requires change. Crisis requires change. Jesus wasn't planning on going to the home of the Roman officer, but he was willing to go. It was a change he was willing to make. When he arrived, the officer sent word that Jesus didn't need to come, right? Jesus is on his way. He's almost there. He sends word up. It's okay. You don't have to come. Here are those verses again, verses 6 and 7. So Jesus went, but just as they arrived at the house, the officer sent some friends to say, Lord, don't trouble yourself by coming to my home, for I am not worthy of such an honor. I'm not even worthy to come and meet you. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I'm under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say, go, and they go, or come, and they come. And if I say to my slaves, do this, they do it. So here's a big change coming next, and it's such a big change that here's what we're told in verse 9. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to the crowd that was following him, he said, I tell you, I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel. Now, I would imagine it takes something pretty significant to amaze Jesus, wouldn't you think? But there he was, amazed. And he rolled right along with it. It didn't faze him. It was a change. It was different, but he was willing to keep right on going. And the man's slave was healed. Well, in our crisis today, or any crisis that we face, honestly, we'll need to be ready and willing to change, to be adaptable, to be flexible. Did I plan to continue to do my job remotely over the last week or so? No, I didn't. But I'm sure glad I still have a job, right? I'm willing to make that change to do what I need to do. Some folks that may be watching right now may have lost their job, or maybe their income has decreased. Look, is this time to make a change, right? Time for things to change. But you can't move forward if you're just going to sit there and whine. If you're just going to sit there and pout, then and complain about the changes happening around you, you're not going to be able to move forward. You've got to be willing to change. So think about those things maybe that you've always wanted to do, but never had the time. Maybe you have time now, right? Think about that job you always wanted, but the time was never right to go for it. Maybe now is the time to go for that other job. I don't know what it is for you, but I know that people of faith don't allow themselves to wallow in self-pity for very long. We may wallow for a little bit, right? But not for very long. You are an overcomer, right? You don't have to stay in a state of pouting and self-pity. So, for instance, in some states, for certain kinds of testing and certification, they're being waived right now because testing and certification centers aren't open. And so maybe there's a certification that can take you to another level in your job, or into another field or something that's easier to get now than ever before because they've waived so much of the requirements. Again, I don't know what that is for you. I don't know what's out there for you, but I know that we're all better off when instead of asking, why me, we're asking, what's next, right? Because a crisis requires change. There's a final thing that I want to point out to you, a fifth thing about crisis, and that is that we need to embrace that a crisis is the time for real leadership. So I'll start this final section by saying what one of my mentors, John Maxwell, says: leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. You, my friend, influence someone. You are a leader to someone. And in a crisis, there really is a need for real leadership to stand out. Thomas Paine said it this way. He said, the real man smiles in trouble, gathers strength from distress, and grows brave by reflection. So there's four things I want to tell you about a real leader. First of all, real leadership is relational, right? Real leaders put people first. Jesus always put people first. In the story of the raising of the widow's only son, Jesus wasn't even asked to do anything. Did you notice that? He saw the need, he had compassion, and he sought to meet the need. That's a leader. He cared about the woman, and so he met the need. And that brings to the second point about a real leader. Real leaders are empathetic. That means they care. That means they can put themselves in other people's shoes. That's why Jesus had compassion on the widow. He was empathetic. He deeply, personally felt her pain and her loss, and he determined to do something about it, which leads to the next point. Real leaders are active, right? Real leaders are relational, they're empathetic, and they're active. They don't sit around and wait for somebody else to do something. They do it. They do something. It might be a little bit, it might be a lot. It doesn't really matter. The point is, They do something. They make a decision. They take a stand. They reach out to others. They provide help. They provide hope. And again, this was Jesus the widow. Again, he wasn't act, he just acted, because that's what leaders do. And then the last point about real leaders is that real leaders are loyal, right? They're relational, they're empathetic, they're active, and they're loyal. This means that they're steadfast, they're dependable, and nobody fits that description better than Jesus. Even before you know that you need him, he's there. It's amazing. There's a song that we sometimes sing in church at this time of year called Lily of the Valley. I'm sure you know it if you heard it. Part of the song says this: in sorrow, he's my comfort. In trouble, he's my stay. That means he's steadfast and he's loyal. And he tells me every care on him to roll. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. He will never, never leave me, nor yet forsake me here. Boy, that's loyalty right there, right? While I live by faith and do his blessed will. There's a wall of fire about me, and I've nothing now to fear. With his manna he my hungry soul shall fill. Jesus is loyal. Jesus was a real leader. He was relational, empathetic, active, and loyal. And right now, the world needs real leaders just like him. Understand this. Again, crisis will come. It comes for all of us. Doesn't matter who we are, what station of life we're in, what our socioeconomic status is, or education level. Crisis comes. Crisis is troubling. It reveals our character. It requires change in our lives. And it's the time for real leadership. And you can be that leader in your family, among your friends, in your church or organization, your job. You can be that leader today. This crisis that we're faced with today, guess what? It'll pass. It'll be over. It's troubling, and it will change us, but we can rise up. We can let God use this for our good and for his glory. And when we do, we'll not only survive this crisis, we will thrive in the midst of it. Not only survive, but thrive by remembering these things. Thank you for watching today. I hope that this has been meaningful and encouraging to you, and I hope that this will help you make changes this week in your life. I look forward to spending time with you again, and please know, especially those of our church family members that have experienced some difficult times this week, we are thinking about you and we're praying for you. We love you, and I hope to see you watching a message next week. Thanks. Have a great day.